Hi, listener. This is From Ideology to Unity, a spiritual journey where we let go of ideological doctrine in favor of meaning, purpose, and unity as a whole. So, I'm going to carry on reading Synchronicity, an Acausal Connecting Principle. So, yeah. The corrections made here do not in any way alter the fact that the maximal frequencies lie with the three classical lunar aspects. In order to assure myself of the chance nature of the result, I undertook one more statistical experiment. I broke up the original and fortuitous chronological order and the equally fortuitous division of the three batches, mixing the first 150 marriages with the last 150, taking the latter in reverse order. That is to say, I put the first marriage on top of the last, and then the second on top of the last but one, and so on. Then I divided the 300 marriages into three batches of 100. The result was as follows. So we've got a chart here with, so on the y-axis you've just got maximum, and on the x-axis you've got first batch, second batch, and third batch. So for first batch, no aspects, 11%. Second batch, the sun, honestly, I don't know how to describe it. Sun, something masculine. I don't know what that symbol is. It's like an upward facing thing, but with no arrow. So, sun symbol and masculine symbol 11%. Moon, masculine symbol moon 11%. Moon, masculine symbol ascending 12%. That's in the third batch. The result of the third batch, the result of the first batch is amusing insofar as only 15 of the 30. Wow, I'm really getting this wrong, huh? The result of the first batch is amusing insofar as only 15 of the 300 marriages have none of the 15 selected aspects in common. The second batch yields 2 maxima, of which the second again represents a classical conjunction. The third batch yields a maximum for moon, masculine ascending, which we already know as the third classical conjunction. The total result shows that another chance arrangement of the marriages can easily produce a result that deviates from the earlier total, but still does not quite prevent the classical conjunctions from turning up. The result of our experiment tallies with our experience of mantic procedures. One has the impression that these methods and others like them create favorable conditions for the occurrence of meaningful coincidences. It is quite true that the verification of synchronistic phenomena is difficult and sometimes an impossible task. It's a difficult and sometimes impossible task. Ryan's achievement in demonstrating, with the help of unacceptable material, the coincidence of a psychic state with a corresponding objective process must therefore be rated all the higher. Despite the fact that statistical method is generally highly unsuited to do justice to unusual events, Ryan's experiments have nonetheless withstood the ruinous influence of statistics. Their results must therefore be taken into account in any assessment of a synchronistic phenomena. In view of the leveling influence which the statistical method has on the quantitative determination of synchronicity, we must ask how it was that Ryan succeeded in obtaining positive results. I maintain that he would never have got the results he did if he had carried out his experiments with a single subject. Footnote, by which I mean a subject chosen at random and not one with specific gifts, or only a few. He needed a constant renewal of interest, an emotion with characteristic abaissement mental, which tips the scales in favor of the unconscious. Only in this way can he space and Only in this way can space and time be relativized to a certain extent, thereby reducing the chances of a causal process. What then happens is a kind of creatio et ex nihilo, an act of creation that is not causally explicable. The mantic procedures owe their effectiveness to the same connection with emotionality. By touching the unconscious aptitude, they stimulate interest, curiosity, expectation, hope, and fear, and consequently evoke a corresponding preponderance of the unconscious. The effective numinous potencies, well, that's what it says, potencies, I don't know how to pronounce that, in the unconscious are the archetypes. By far the greatest number of spontaneous synchronistic phenomena that I have ever had the occasion to observe and analyze can easily be shown to have a direct connection with an archetype. This in itself is an irrepresentable psychic factor of the collective unconscious. The latter cannot be localized, since it is either complete in principle in every individual or is found to be the same everywhere. You can never say with certainty whether it appears to be going on in the collective unconscious of a single individual. No, you can never say with certainty whether what appears to be going on in the collective unconscious of a single individual is not also happening in other individuals or organisms or things or situations. When, for instance, the vision arose in Swedenborg's mind of a fire in Stockholm, there was a real fire raging there at the same time, without there being any demonstrable or even thinkable connection between the two. Footnote. This case is well authenticated. See report in Kant's Dreams of a Spirit Seer, illustrated by Dreams of Metaphysics. English translation, London, 1900. I certainly would not like to undertake to prove the archetypal connection in this case. I would only point to the fact that in Swedenborg's biography, there are certain things which throw a remarkable light on his psychic state. We must assume that there was a lowering of the threshold of consciousness, which gave him access to absolute knowledge, in inverted commas. The fire in Stockholm was, in a sense, burning in him too, for the unconscious psyche, space and time seem to be relative. That is to say, knowledge finds itself in a space-time continuum in which space is no longer space nor time. If, therefore, the unconscious should develop or maintain a potential in the direction of conscious, then it is possible for parallel events to be perceived or known. So it's interesting that, space and time, when it involves synchronicity, are ultimately one and the same and not really meaningful, like it's all one location in time and one location in space, essentially. Compared with Rhine's work, the great disadvantage of my astrological statistics lies in the fact that the entire experiment was carried out on only one subject, myself. I did not experiment with a variety of subjects, rather it was the variety of material that challenged my interest. I was thus in the position of a subject who was at first enthusiastic, but afterwards calls off becoming habituated to the ESP experiment. The results therefore deteriorated with the growing number of experiments, which in this case corresponded to the exposition of the material in the batches, so that the accumulation of larger numbers only blurred the favorable initial results. Equally, my final experiment showed that the discarding of the original order and the division of the horoscopes into arbitrary batches produce, as might be expected, a different picture, though its significance is not altogether clear. Rhine's rules are to be recommended wherever, as in medicine, very large numbers are not involved. In interest and expectancy of the investigator might well be accompanied synchronistically by surprisingly favorable results to begin with, despite every precaution. These will be interpreted as miracles only by persons insufficiently acquainted with the statistical character of natural law, or sufficiently with faith, irrespective of statistical law, natural law. If, and it seems plausible, the meaningful coincidence or cross-connection of events cannot be explained causally, then the connecting principle must lie in the equal significance of parallel events. In other words, their tertium comparationis is meaning. We are so accustomed to regard meaning as a psychic process or content that it never enters our heads to suppose that it could exist outside the psyche. But we do know at least enough about the psyche not to attribute it to any magical power, and still less can we attribute it to any magical power to the conscious mind. If, therefore, we entertain the hypothesis that one and the same transcendental meaning might manifest itself simultaneously in the human psyche and in the arrangement of external and independent event, we might at once come into conflict with the conventional scientific and epistemological views. Well, to that I say, why not? We have to remind ourselves over and over again of the merely statistical validity of natural laws and of the effect of the statistical method in eliminating all unusual occurrences, if we want to lend an ear to such a hypothesis. The great difficulty is that we have absolutely no scientific means of proving the existence of an objective meaning which is not a psychic product. The thing is, the elites know full well that there are things they know of existing that they know can't be proven by science, and they know that mainstream science is in the dark about things that they know are true and yet aren't scientifically verifiable, and yet I still know are true. We are, however, driven to some such assumption unless we want to regress to a magical causality and ascribe the psyche a power that far exceeds its empirical range of action. Well, is it really regress to go beyond empiricism? Or is merely being stuck with the limitation of mere empiricism actually what is the regression? Well, maybe I'm making judgments. In that case, we should have to suppose, if we don't want to let causality go, well, we might, either that Swedenborg's unconscious staged the Stockholm fire, or conversely, that the objective element activated in quite some inconceivable manner the corresponding images in Swedenborg's brain. In either case, we come up against the unfavorable question of transmission discussed above. It is, of course, entirely a matter of subjective opinion which hypothesis is felt to make more sense. Nor does tradition help us in choosing between magical causality and transcendental meaning. Well, it could be both. Because on the one hand, the primitive mentality, so to speak, has always explained synchronicity as magical causality right down to our own day. And on the other hand, philosophy assumed a secret correspondence or meaningful connection between natural events until the 18th century. I prefer the latter hypothesis because it does not, like the first, conflict with the empirical concept of causality, and can count as a principle sui generis. That obliges us not indeed to correct the principles of natural explanation as hitherto understood, but at least to add to their number, an operation which only the most cogent reasons could justify. I believe, however, that the hints I have given in the foregoing constitute an argument that needs thorough consideration. Psychology of all the sciences cannot in the long run afford to overlook such experiences. These things are too important for an understanding of the unconscious, quite apart from their philosophical implications. Note that we're on page 93 at this point. I just thought I'd tell you. Appendix to chapter 2. The following notes have been compiled by the editors on the basis of Professor Fier's mathematical arguments, of which he kindly furnished a precis. These represent his latest thoughts on the topic. These data are presented here for the benefit of readers with a special interest in mathematics or statistics who want to know how the figures in the text were arrived at. Wow. Have fun. Since an orbit of 8 degrees was taken as the basis of Professor Jung's calculations for the estimation of conjunctions and oppositions, CFP page 64, it follows that for a particular relation between two heavenly bodies to be called a conjunction, one of them must lie within an arc of 16 degrees. Since the only concern was to test the character of distribution, an arc of 15 degrees was taken for convenience. Now, all positions on a circle of 360 degrees are equally probable. Now, the probability that the heavenly body will lie on an arc of 15 degrees is, okay, it's got this A symbol, I think that's alpha. The probability alpha that the heavenly body will lie on an arc of 15 degrees is alpha equals, I'm not even sure if that's alpha, but it looks like an A, but goes up as well as down at the end of it, at the tail. Alpha equals 15 over 360 equals 1 over 24. This probability alpha holds every respect. Let n be the number of particular aspects which will occur in, let small n be the number of particular aspects that will occur in big N married pairs if the probability that will occur in one unmarried pair be alpha. Applying the binomial distribution, we get W underscore N, small n that is, equals big N apostrophe over small n apostrophe open bracket, big N minus small n close bracket exclamation mark, multiplied by A to the power of n, alpha to the power of n, open bracket 1 minus alpha close bracket, big N minus to the power of big N minus n. Look, I'm not sure if I can do that justice, to be honest. If you're looking at YouTube, you might really see it. Right. In order to obtain this numerical evaluation of W instead of the power, it's below instead, but underscore N. Wow, well, clearly I'm not an advanced mathematician by any means. Brackets 2 can be simplified. This results in an error, which, however, is not important. The simplification can be arrived at by replacing bracket 2 by the Poisson distribution. P underscore small n equals 1 over small n exclamation mark times x to the power of small n dot, a big dot thing. Wow, this is, I hope it's entertaining hearing me stumble over this. Multiply by e to the power of minus x. Yeah, so this approximation is valid if alpha may be regarded as small in comparison with 1 while x is finite. Okay, good, we've pretty much got to the, almost got past some maths, which is good because, yeah. Upon the basis of these considerations, the following numerical results can be arrived at. A, the probability of moon, okay, it's a circle with a diagonal arrow, but without an end to that arrow facing upwards, between the moon and the sun. Okay, so moon, I'll call that 2. So moon to sun, moon to moon, and moon to ascending, turning up simultaneously is alpha to the power of 3 equals, open brackets, 1 over 24 close bracket to the power of 3. Squiggly line, 1 over 10,000. Yeah, I mean, I might as well not be saying this, but I'm going to say it anyway just because I decided I'd read all the way through. So there we go. B, the probability big P for the maximal figures in the three batches is 1. I'm sure if you're a mathematician, you are cringing so hard, and I'm sorry. 1, 18 aspects in 180 married pairs. P is 1:1000. 2, 24 aspects in 220 married pairs. P equals 1 to 10,000. 3, 8 aspects in 83 married pairs. P equals 1 to 50 editors. There you go. Now I'm through that torture. The joy. Forerunners of the idea of synchronicity is chapter 3. The causality principle asserts that the connection between cause and effect is a necessary one. The synchronistic principle asserts that the terms of a meaningful coincidence are connected by simultaneity and meaning. So if we assume that the ESP experiments and numerous other observations are established facts, we must conclude that besides the connection between cause and effect, there is another factor in nature which expresses itself in the arrangement of events and appears to us as meaning. Although meaning is an anthropomorphic interpretation, it nevertheless forms an indispensable criterion of synchronicity. What that factor which appears to us as meaning may be in itself, we have no possibility of knowing. As an hypothesis, however, it is not quite so impossible that may appear at first sight. We must remember that the rationalistic attitude of the West is not the only possible one and is not all-embracing, but is in many ways a prejudice and a bias that ought perhaps to be corrected. Well said, Jung. The very much older civilization of the Chinese has always thought differently from us in this respect. And we have to go back to Heraclitus if we want to find something similar in our civilization. Okay, I know in gold, so there we go. And that was hanging up, so no idea. All right, so note that I find it particularly interesting, and I remember reading this at the time. It is quite interesting to me that we had to go back to Heraclitus to get similar philosophical principles in Western philosophy to Chinese philosophy. So that just says something interesting, I think. Only in astrology, alchemy, and mantic procedures do we find no difference of principle between the attitude and our attitude and the Chinese. That is why alchemy developed along parallel lines in East and West, and why both ambits it strove towards the same goal with more or less identical ideas. Oh, I've been called again. Excuse me then. So, well, I'll have to edit that out or not. We'll see. Maybe I won't bother, or maybe I'll just keep it as it is. All right. All right. So, this is why alchemy developed along parallel lines in East and West, and why both ambits strove towards the same goal, more or less, with more or less identical ideas. In Chinese philosophy, one of the oldest and most central ideas is that of the Tao, which the Jesuits translated as God. But that is correct only for a Western way of thinking. Other translations, such as providence and the like, are mere makeshifts. Richard Wilhelm brilliantly interprets it as meaning. Wilhelm and Jung, The Secret of the Golden Flower. Yeah, that'll be enough. The concept of Tao pervades the whole philosophical thought of China. Causality occupies the paramount position with us, but it acquired its importance only in the course of the last 2 centuries, thanks to the leveling influence of the statistical method on one hand and the unparalleled success of the natural sciences on the other, which brought the metaphysical view of the world into dispute. Lao Tzu gives the following description of the Tao in his celebrated Tao Te Ching. There is something formless yet complete that existed before heaven and earth. How still, how empty, dependent on nothing, unchanging, all-pervading, unfailing. One may think of it as the mother of all things under heaven. I do not know its name, but I call it meaning. And if I had to give it a name, I should call it the Great. Tao covers the 10,000 things like a garment, but does not claim to be master over them. Tao covers the 10,000 things like a garment, but does not claim to master over them. Lao Tzu describes it as nothing, by which he means, says Wilhelm, only its contrast with the world of reality. Lao Tzu describes its nature as follows. We put 30 spokes together and call it a wheel, but it is on the space where is nothing that the utility of the wheel depends. We turn clay to make a wheel. There. I'll just start again since I messed it up. We put 30 spokes together and call it a wheel, but it is on the space where there is nothing that the utility of the wheel depends. We turn clay to make a vessel, but it is on the space where there is nothing that the utility of the vessel depends. We pierce doors and windows to make a house, and it is on these spaces where there is nothing that the utility of the house depends. Therefore, just as we take advantage of what is, we should recognize the utility of what is not. Nothing is evidently meaning or purpose. It is only called nothing because it does not manifest itself in the world of the senses, but is only its organizer. Wilhelm, Chinesische Lebens, so we do that. I'm just giving up on pronouncing it. Lebensweisheit. Shit. Page 15. The relation between meaning, Tao, and reality cannot be conceived either under the category of cause and effect. Lao Tzu says, because the eye gazes but can catch no glimpse of it, it is called elusive. Because the ear listens but cannot hear it, it is called the rare feed. Because the hand feels for it but cannot find it, it is called, maybe I should just call this episode Nick mispronouncing things. Perhaps that would be like the most accurate description to any of my episodes. Okay, let me try again. I might learn to speak at some point. All right. Because the eye gazes and can catch no glimpse of it, it is called elusive. Because the ear listens but can hear and cannot hear it, it is called the rarefied. Because the hand feels for it but cannot find it, it's called the infinitesimal. These are called the shapeless shapes, forms without form, vague semblances. Go towards them, and you can see no front. Go after them, and you can see no rear. Wilhelm describes it as a borderline conception lying at the extreme edge of the world of appearances. In it, the opposites cancel out in non-discrimination, but are still potentially present. These seeds, he continues, point to something that corresponds firstly to the visible, i.e. something in the nature of an image. Secondly, to the audible, i.e. something in the nature of words. Thirdly, to extension in space, i.e. something with a form. But these three things are clearly distinguished and definable, and are non-spatial and non-temporal unity, having no above and below or front and back. As the Tao Te Ching says, incommensurable, impalpable, yet latent in its are forms. Impalpable, incommensurable, yet within it are entities. Shadowy it is and dim. Reality, thinks Wilhelm, is conceptually knowable because according to the Chinese view, there is in all things a latent rationality. This is the basic idea underlying meaningful coincidence. It is possible because both sides have the same meaning. Where meaning prevails, order results. Tao is eternal, but has no name. The uncarved block, though seemingly of small account, is greater than anything under heaven. If the kings and barons would possess themselves of it, the 10,000 creatures would flock to do them homage. Heaven and earth would conspire. Descend, sweet dew, without law or compulsion, men would dwell in harmony. Tao never does, yet through it all things are done. Heaven's net is wide, coarse are the meshes, yet nothing slips through. Something came to mind, and I don't know why. And what it has to do with is the fact that I'm going through a process of raising my frequency like many are. But I don't pretend to be, I'm not like enlightened necessarily, right? I've, in a sense, had a spiritual awakening of a sort, perhaps, and I have been able to open my heart chakra, but I find that it often closes. So, I mean, I concluded recently that I was actually subconsciously ashamed to a great degree without even knowing it. So, and I've definitely, in the last 6 months, for example, had a fair bit of fear at times. Like, so, I mean, I do have to recognize that the idea that I'm consistently at the love frequency and that even though I focus on love and I love the idea of relating to love and putting it forth and embodying it is very appealing. How even my ego likes the idea of it a lot, you know. And I suppose this is what everyone grapples with on their awakening journey, where you don't get there overnight. It takes time, right? And if authenticity is important, if honesty is important, well, I never meant to give the impression that I thought I was absolutely full to the brim of love and absolutely enlightened and had no progress to go there and was absolutely just full on a light worker in every single way. With like, maybe I did give that impression, but I don't know. But that's not how it is, and I don't know. It feels kind of important to clarify, I suppose, even if it's obvious that I'm aiming at unity. I'm aiming at love, unconditional love. Like, doesn't mean I'm there. I mean, from ideology to unity, if anything, kind of represents where I'm at, is in the from bit. I'm going there. I'm there. I'm going towards unity, right? And I suppose, just as it's for me, that whole journey is also for the listener. Although, I mean, the listener may well be more enlightened than me or whatever, you know? They might not be. It depends who they are, really. Anyway, there must be some reason why you listen to me if you do. All right. So, Chuang Tzu, a contemporary of Plato's, says the psychological premises on which Tao is based. Quote, the state in which ego and non-ego are no longer opposed is called the pivot of Tao. It sounds like a criticism of our scientific view of the world when he remarks that Tao is obscured when you fix your eye on the segments of existence only, or limitations are not the originally grounded. Limitations are not originally grounded in the meaning of life. Originally, words had no fixed meanings. Differences only arose through looking at things subjectively. So from this perspective, objectivity is unity perspective. And anything other than a unified perspective is subjective. You know, that actually clarifies things because, yeah, in previous episodes, I have discussed what is objective and what is subjective. Is there an objective at all? An objectivity? Like, perhaps we can say that there is, and that's the unified God perspective in a sense. But since we are not really, well, you know, we are merely mortal, or at least currently, you know, we're at a certain level of spiritual development, so we're at the subjective. The sages of old, says Chuang Tzu, took as their starting point a state when the existence of things had not yet begun. That is indeed the extreme limit beyond which you cannot go. The next assumption was that through things existed, they had not yet begun to be separated. Was that though things existed, they had not yet begun to be separated. The next, that though things were separated in a sense, affirmation and negation had not yet begun. When affirmation and negation came into being, Tao faded. After Tao faded, then came one-sided detachments. Okay, so something I want to mention here as well is that this seems to evoke the idea that limitation is something we create, and that when we're very young, we have got less separation. We see more things as is, as they are. We don't label things so much. We don't attach our arbitrary meanings to things so much. We don't attach separation and limitation to things so much. And in many ways, spirituality is learning to unlearn the separation we've learned. To continue, outward hearing should not penetrate further than the ear. The intellect should not seek to lead a separate existence. Thus the soul can become empty and absorb the whole world. It is Tao that fills this emptiness. If you have insight, says Chuang-Tzu, quote, you use your inner eye, your inner ear, to pierce the heart of things and have no need of intellectual knowledge. This is obviously an allusion to the absolute knowledge of the unconscious and to the presence in the microcosm of the macrocosmic events. I mean, that's a Hermetic principle, fundamentally, just the Eastern equivalent of it. This Taoistic view is typical of Chinese thinking. It is, whenever possible, a thinking in terms of the whole, a point which also brought out by Marcel Granet, the eminent authority on Chinese psychology. This peculiarity can be seen in ordinary conversation with the Chinese. What seems to us as perfectly straightforward, a precise question about some detail evokes from the Chinese thinker an unexpectedly elaborate answer, as though one had asked him for a blade of grass and got a whole meadow in return. With us, details are important for their own sakes. For the Oriental mind, they always complete a total picture. In this totality, as in primitive or our own medieval pre-scientific psychology, still very much alive, are included things which seem to be connected with one another only by chance, by a coincidence whose meaningfulness appears altogether arbitrary. This is where the theory of correspondentia comes in, which was propounded by the natural philosophers of the Middle Ages, and particularly the classical idea of the sympathy of all things. So there's correspondentia. There's a footnote. Professor W. Pauly kindly calls my attention to the fact that Niels Bohr used correspondence as a mediating term between the representation of the discontinuum particle and the continuum wave. Originally, 1913 to 18, he called it the principle of correspondence, but later, in 1927, it was formulated as the argument of correspondence. Wow, so Jung did talk to Pauly, the quantum physicist, about it. Who also talked to Niels Bohr, and they were quantum physicists who the discontinuum and the continuum. So there's definitely a mystic aspect of this, even consciously aware, that Pauly and Niels Bohr were aware of. I mean, even more reason to suppose that quantum physics is linked to mysticism. Absolutely. There's no reason why we can't take a quantum route to get to mysticism, and why we can't use quantum physics. We can use quantum physics to back up mysticism and string theory as well, or maybe M theory, because that's a more advanced version of it. Hippocrates says, there is one common flow, one common breathing, all things in sympathy. The whole organism and each one of its parts are working in conjunction for the same purpose. The great principle extends to the extremest part, and from the extremest part it returns to the great principle, to the one nature, being and nothing. Or not being is actually what I meant to say. Being and not being. So there's a holism and a unity perspective in that, that Hippocrates had in his perspective. And it seems to suggest that being and not being are the same thing, which is a non-dualistic perspective. And oneness is a non-dualistic perspective. So yeah, Hippocrates was wise. The universal principle is found even in the smallest particle, which therefore corresponds to the whole. In this connection, there is an interesting idea in Philo, 25 BC to AD 42. God, being minded to unite in intimate and loving fellowship, the beginning and end of created things, made heaven the beginning and man the end. The one the most perfect of imperishable objects of sense, the other the noblest of things earth-born and perishable, being in very truth a miniature heaven. He bears about within himself, like holy images, endowments of nature that correspond to the constellations. For since the corruptible and the incorruptible are by nature contrary the one to the other, God assigned the fairest of each sort to the beginning and the end. Heaven, as I've said, to the beginning, and man to the end. Seems to just a so within, so without, sort of so above, so below sort of thing. And on that note, here is the great principle or beginning. Heaven is infused into man, the microcosm, who reflects the star-like natures, and thus, as the smallest part and end of the work of creation, contains the whole. And this reminds me wholly of that there's different densities that make up an octave, and that essentially within us is 7 densities, and if you make that 7 whole densities make up a potentially a person or someone's energy body. So yeah, and this is holism, unity, oneness perspective. According to Theophrastus, 371 to 288 BC, the supersensuous and the sensuous are joined by a bond of community. This bond cannot be mathematics, so presumably there must presumably be God. Similarly, in Plotinus, the individual souls born of the world soul are related to one another by sympathy or antipathy, regardless of distance. So what? I don't know what sympathy is meaning here. No, you could say universal love and universal. Yeah. Fear is the absence of love. Hatred is a distortion of love. Whatever. Similar views are found in the Pico della Rendola. Firstly, there is unity in things whereby each thing is at one with itself, consists of itself, and coheres with itself. Secondly, there is the unity whereby one creature is united with the others, and all parts of the world constitute one world. Well, Gaia, right? The third and most important unity is that whereby the whole universe is one with its creator, as an army with its commander. So it's like a chain of being or hierarchy of being, and everything is linked as part of one whole, one that's more than the sum of its parts. I mean, definitely these all fitting a common theme here, and it's all building up like a pancake? Cake. So like a cake, I suppose. or sandwich. By this threefold unity, Pico means a simple unity which, like the Trinity, has three aspects. A unity distinguished by a threefold character, yet in a way not to depart from the simplicity of unity. For him, the world is one being, a visible God, in which everything is naturally arranged from the very beginning like parts of a living organism. The world appears as a corpus mysticum of God, just as the church is the corpus mysticum of Christ, or a well-disciplined army can be called a sword in the hand of the commander. The view that all things are arranged according to God's will is one that leaves little room for causality. Just as in the living body, the different parts work in harmony and are meaningfully adjusted to one another, so events in the world stand for a meaningful relationship which cannot be derived from any immanent causality. The reason for this is that in either case, the behavior of the parts depends on the central control, which is superordinate to them. Unless we go with a pantheist perspective of things, or panpsychism, which is more precisely what I'm talking about. Because what is quoted there isn't inherently what's that determinism called? Determinism with no free will. It's not inherently that. So, I mean, there's also the idea of determinism with free will, or even neither determinism nor free will, and yet the overall pantheistic sort of everything being a unified whole thing. And then there's the idea that perhaps for different beings there are different degrees of free will or not free will for different souls. So it may depend on the extent of conscious to unconsciousness that is conscious to unconsciousness that is present in that soul, that being. So an unconscious being would have the potential for free will, but it would be manifesting none. And a conscious being would be manifesting more free will, and depends how conscious to unconscious it is. Note that according to the law of one, binaries are ultimately one and the same. So there's this thing of like opposite concepts are often used like one than the other, one slash the other. So white slash black, or whatever, any light slash dark, or yeah, like that. In his treatise De Hominis Dignitae, Pico says the Father implanted in man at birth seeds of all kind and germs of original life. Just as God is the copula of the world, so the created world is man. Quote, let us make man in our image, who is not a fourth world or anything but a new nature, but is rather the fusion and synthesis of three worlds, the supercelestial, the celestial, and the sublunary. In body and spirit, man is, quote, the little God of the world, quote. The microcosm, like God, therefore, is a center of events, and all things revolve around him. This thought, so utterly strange to the modern mind, dominated man's picture of the world until a few generations ago, when the natural science proved man's subordination to nature and his extreme dependence on causes. The idea of the correlation between events and meaning now assigned exclusively to man, was banished to such a remote and benighted region that the intellect lost track of it altogether. So, I mean, yeah, it reminds me of the whole idea of each soul is a fragment of God, source. Schopenhauer remembered it somewhat belatedly after it had formed one of the chief items in Leibniz's scientific explanations. By virtue of his microcosmic nature, man is a son of the firmament or macrocosm. I am a star traveling together with you. No, I like the sound of that. Reminds me of the law of one in some sense. The initiate confesses in the Mithraic liturgy. In alchemy, the microcosmos has the same significance as the rotundum, a favorite symbol since the time of Zosimos of Panopolis, which was also known as the monad. The idea of the inner and outer man together formed the whole. Well, it's a Greek word, I can't pronounce that. The something of Hippocrates, a microcosm or smallest part wherein the greater principle is undividedly present, but also characterizes the thought of Agrippa von Nettesheim. He says, it is the unanimous consent of all Platonists that, as is in the archetypal world, all things are in all, so also in this corporeal world, all things are in all, albeit in different ways, according to the receptive nature of each. Thus the elements are not only these inferior bodies, but also in the heavens, in stars, in devils, divels, in angels, and lastly in God, the maker and archetype of all things. So instead of divels, maybe it was saying devils, I don't know. But yeah, well, that fits into the theme of the law of one. The ancients had said, quote, all things are full of gods, end quote. Those gods were, quote, divine powers which are diffused in things, end quote. Zoroaster had called them, quote, divine allurements, end quote, and Synesius, quote, symbolic enticements, end quote. This latter interpretation comes very close indeed to the idea of the archetypal projections in modern psychology, although from the time of Synesius until quite recently, there was no epistemological criticism, let alone the newest form of it, namely psychological criticism. Agrippa shares with the Platonists the view that there is an immanent power in the things of the lower world which makes them agree to a large extent with the things of the upper world, and that as a result, the animals are connected with the divine bodies, i.e. the stars, and exert an influence on them. Here he quotes Virgil, quote, I, for my part, do not believe that they, the rooks, are endowed with the divine spirit with a foreknowledge of things greater than the oracle. End quote. Agrippa is thus suggesting that there is an inborn knowledge or imagination in living organisms, an idea which recurs in our own day in Hans Dreist. Whether we like it or not, we find ourselves in this embarrassing position as soon as we begin to seriously reflect on the teleological process in biology or to investigate the compensatory function of the unconscious, not to speak of trying to explain the phenomenon of synchronicity. Final causes, twist them how we will, postulate a foreknowledge of some kind. It is certainly not a knowledge that could be connected with the ego, and hence not a conscious knowledge as we know it, but rather a self-subsistent unconscious knowledge, which I would prefer to call absolute knowledge. Though I'm wondering, the self can be found in the unconscious, but is ultimately conscious, more conscious than the ego, is it not? So perhaps it's the self. Or is the self just the overall psyche as a whole? It is not cognition, but, as Leibniz so excellently calls it, a perceiving, which consists, or to be more cautious, seems to consist of images of subjectless simulacra. The postulated images are presumably the same as my archetypes, which can be shown to be formal factors and spontaneous fantasy products. Expressed in modern language, the microcosm which contains the images of all creation would be the collective unconscious. By the spiritus mundi, the ligamentum animae et corporis, the quinta essentia, which he shares with the alchemists. Agrippa probably means what we would call the unconscious, the spirit that penetrates all things or shapes all things is the world soul. The soul of the world, therefore, is a certain only thing, feeling all things, bestowing all things, binding and knitting together all things, that might be one frame of the world. Those things in which this spirit is particularly powerful, therefore have a tendency to beget their like. In other words, to produce correspondences or meaningful coincidences. Agrippa gives a long list of these correspondences based on the numbers 1 to 12. A similar but more alchemical table of correspondences can be found in a treatise of Aegidius de Vadis. Of these, I would only mention the Scala Unitatis because it is especially interesting from a point of view of the history of symbols. Iod, the first letter of the tetragrammaton, the divine name, anima mundi, soul, lapis philosophorum, cor Lucifer. I must contend myself with saying that this is an attempt to set up a hierarchy of archetypes, and that tendencies in this direction can be shown to exist in the unconscious. Okay, so some thoughts I want to add here. Well, honestly, I don't know really what to add because, I mean, it kind of speaks for itself, doesn't it? Okay, there is a footnote on the last page, which I could mention. The zoologist A.C. Hardy reaches similar conclusions. Perhaps our ideas on evolution may be altered if something akin to telepathy, unconscious no doubt, were found to be a factor in molding the patterns of behavior among members of a species. If there were such a non-conscious group behavior plan distributed between and linking the individuals of the race, we might find ourselves coming back to something like those ideas of the subconscious racial memory of Samuel Butler, but on the group rather than the individual basis. Well, indeed, right? I would not be surprised if that were true. Now, people, given that we're into New Age stuff and the like, I do find that we do have a lot of interest in some of these things. We're coming at it from the other angle, the other direction from Jung, right? It's kind of meeting in the middle between the New Age on one hand and psychology on the other. And this is like, so I feel like we can appreciate it, just not in the same way that more psychologically minded people would. Not that anyone isn't psychologically minded. Agrippa was an older contemporary of Theophrastus Paracelsus, Theophrastus Paracelsus, and is known to have had a considerable influence on him. So it is not surprising if the thinking of Paracelsus proves to be steeped in the idea of correspondence. He says, if a man will be a philosopher without going astray, he must lay the foundations of his philosophy by making heaven and earth a microcosm, and not be wrong by a hair's breadth. Therefore, he who will lay the foundations of medicine must also guard against the slightest error, and must make from the microcosm the revolution of heaven and earth, so that the philosopher does not find anything in heaven and earth which he does not also find in man, and the physician does not find anything in man which heaven and earth do not have. And these do too differ only in outward form, and yet the form on both sides which is understood as pertaining to one thing. The Paragranium has pointed psychological remarks to make about physicians. For this reason, we assume not 4, but 1 arcanium, which is, however, 4 square, like a tower facing the 4 winds, and as little as a tower may lack a corner, so little the physician lack one of the parts. At the same time, he who knows how the world is symbolized by an egg in its shell, how a chick with all its substance lies hidden within it. Thus, everything in the world and in man must lie hidden in the physician. Thus, and just the hens, by their brooding, transform the world prefigured in the shell into a chick. So alchemy brings into maturity the philosophical arcana lying in the physician. Herein lies the error of those who do not understand the physician aright. What this means for alchemy, I've shown in some detail in my Psychology and Alchemy. Johannes Kepler thought in much the same way. He says in his Tertius Interveniens 1610, this, viz. A geometrical principle underlying the physical world, is also, according to the doctrine of Aristotle, the strongest tie that links the lower world to the heavens and unifies it therewith, so that all its forms are governed from on high, and from in this lower world, that is to say the globe of the earth, there is inherent a spiritual nature capable of geometria, which ex instinctu creaturis sine ratio sine bione comes to life and stimulates itself into a use of its forces through the geometrical and harmonious combination of the heavenly rays of light. Whether all plants and animals, as well as the globe of the earth, have this faculty in themselves, I cannot say. But it is an unbelievable thing, for in these things, e.g., in the fact that flowers have a definite color, form, and number of petals, there is at work the instinctus divinus rationis participeps, and not at all man's own knowledge, that man too, through his own soul and his lower faculties, has a like affinity to the heavens as has the soil of the earth, can be tested and proven in many ways. Concerning the astrological character, i.e. astrological synchronicity,
time, Nick.
all right.
It's 5-2. You've got 5 minutes.
Yes, I know. I'm going to finish off and do the editing later.
Time?
Later. All right, this will require some editing. All right, so bye for now.